Welcome to the TG3 podcast. I'm Nick Willis, and I'm here with Ryan Doherty and Rob Westervelt. And we would like to talk a little bit today about defining the problem and the importance of defining the problem. Guys, have you ever been in a meeting and wondered what problem you were trying to solve? I know I've been in meetings like that where I've been sitting there for about a half an hour and I feel like, what am I doing here? And what are we trying to even do in this meeting? Have you ever had that feeling, Ryan?
Probably too many times to admit, but even recently I was in a meeting where the meeting started out with the person in charge defining the problem for us, and the problem was we didn't have enough revenue.
So what was the problem in your mind with that explanation that we didn't have enough revenue?
Well, it started with kind of what we needed to do to solve it, right, which is get more revenue, but it also was such a big problem for me that it almost made me feel a little bit stuck and helpless in it. It's kind of like world peace. Like, where do you start, right?
Yes.
And I had that moment of thinking, how am I going to solve that particular problem in my role?
So, what feelings were happening with you, Ryan, when you had this moment? You're sitting in this meeting and you feel like the problem's being misdiagnosed. What are you feeling like?
Well, I think the first question I had was like, how do I bring that up? Because this is my boss saying this. And also, how do I reframe this so that it's not our problem, but it's the customer's problem that they're experiencing? And then how do we get it to something that's actionable, that is really a root problem and not just the forest instead of the tree? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the reasons that this comes up a lot is you're sitting in a meeting and you may not be the person in the room that's in charge. And you here's a potential solution to a problem, or here's a problem that we have, and it's not the actual problem. So, I mean, Ryan, how do you even start to deal with something like that? Is it just impossible?
No, I think what I tried to do in that moment, which I'm not sure was effective, but it was essentially trying to reframe the problem for the people in the room to move out of, like, if we have more money, everything will be good, right? Because I just think that's an unsolvable problem at that scope. And so trying to bring a conversation and perspective that maybe we didn't start with was really important. And it also made me feel like I could take ownership of the things that were actually leading to that issue that this person identified.
Yeah. How about you, Rob? Have you ever experienced anything like this?
No, never. No, I think this is a classic problem that we all face from time to time, and it really reminds me of a story I once heard from a guy named Bernie Roth at Stanford.
What was it? What was the story?
So Bernie Roth is the dean of faculty at the Stanford Design School, and he was giving a presentation one time, and he's kind of known for being an innovator, and this woman walks up to him, and she says, "Hey, Bernie, you got to help me. I got a big problem that I've been trying to solve, and I just can't solve it. And I cannot find a spouse, and I've tried everything to get a spouse, and nothing's worked." And he kind of looks at her and goes, "Okay, well," and this is sort of his formula. He says, "Well, if you found a spouse, what would that do for you?" And she said, "Oh, well, that's easy. I'd have companionship." And he writes down on the board, "How do I find companionship?" And he goes, "My number one rule to problem solving is don't ask a question in the form of an answer."
What do you mean by that?
So her question, "How do I find a spouse?" was really an answer. I need to find a spouse. And what Bernie Roth showed her was, he's like, well, that's one possible answer to the question, how do I find companionship? But you could easily get a dog, join a church, get a hobby and find some friends. You know, there's lots of potential answers to your real problem, which is finding companionship.
Yeah. So how do you get yourself into a mode where you can look at the real problem and not at a specific solution that you want to walk away with?
Yeah, that's a good question. And kind of thinking about what Ryan was experiencing and understanding the difference between a symptom and a problem. So like going back to Ryan's situation, and you hear this a lot, man, we don't have enough revenue, or maybe we don't have enough customers. Well, that's a problem for sure, right? But it's really more of a symptom of some bigger issue that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So how do you know necessarily if you're just talking about a symptom, or how do you know that you've gotten to the root of the real problem? Or how, if I'm sitting in a meeting and I just feel like, man, I just feel like I just want to leave. I just don't know what's going on here. How do you start to get to the root?
Well, I'll tell you what, the first thing you have to do is check in with your feelings, right? When your spider senses are tingling in that meeting and you're like, I don't feel like we're solving the problem. I feel like what we're doing is creating more problems. That's the place to start and say, why do I feel this way? And usually the reason is because you're not actually addressing the real problem. And so oftentimes what will happen when we address symptoms, in the case of this woman, let's say we say, oh, here's a guy who will marry you. And then they get married, and then she finds out, hey, this guy like wants to stay at home all the time. He doesn't talk a lot. He doesn't like to go out at all. So now I still have the same problem, right? And we do that all the time, even at work. We cure symptoms without addressing the actual underlying problems.
Yeah, so Ryan, going back to you, I'm just wondering, what do you even do when you're in one of these situations? Like, how do you personally like lead a team through? Is it an exercise? Is it just a mind state that you need to be in to be able to really address real problems and avoid like treating symptoms?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a habit to it, right? You have to get good at looking at things from a different perspective. I think it's almost like the difference between two questions. One of them is, what's the sum of 5 plus 5? And then the other is, which two numbers added together give you 10? It sounds like a very similar question, but one of them opens up the door to a lot of solutions. The other one does not. And I think for me, even when looking back to the example I gave earlier, the way I would probably do that with a team and in that meeting is ask questions about that statement. So we don't have enough revenue. Well, why don't we have enough revenue? And then maybe it was like, well, because we don't have enough customers. Well, why don't we have enough customers? Well, because we're not getting enough into our store, or they don't value our product, or our price point's too high. And Toyota used this back in the day, the 5 whys. Like, if you keep asking the why, then you can get out of symptom diagnosis, you can get into problem diagnosis. And I don't know, Nick, if you've ever gone to a doctor's office where doctors usually ask you quite a few questions before they tell you what they think is going on with you.
Yeah.
And I heard somebody tell me that they went to their doctor and they had shoulder pain, and the guy asked them, quite a series of like 15 questions. At the end, he said, oh, this is what I think is going on. And the patient said, well, when did you know that was the problem? And he said, oh, after the first question I asked.
Yeah, right.
But I wanted to make sure I wasn't treating a symptom. I was actually getting to the root problem.
Yeah, I actually think, and you guys can comment on this, that I think that this can be a big piece of organization's culture. And that is, how do you feel as an organization when somebody starts asking those questions? And there's two things that I feel like can kind of happen, and that is that you welcome the question. You say, we need to dig deeper into this and really understand what is the root problem we're dealing with. And then the other is to almost like give you a dirty look. It's like you start asking, now, wait a second. So why do we want the revenue, or why do you really want to be married? And somebody's kind of like, get out of town, man. I don't want to hear this. I already know what I want. Have you guys? What do you guys think of that, Rob? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in organizations, especially when you're in those meetings, the people who are in those problem-solving meetings are problem solvers, right? They want to get a problem solved. The problem that happens, though, is that they start creating solutions without defining the problem accurately. And so then they get a solution, and this is where you find yourself in a meeting where you're like, okay, we have all these solutions popping up, but they're not actually solving our actual problem. Now I'm going to leave this meeting with all this extra work to do, and I still have the problem that I have. So my life is even worse.
Yes, much worse. So what's the big takeaway here? Like, Ryan, tell me, what do you do, or what would you suggest to somebody who's sitting in that meeting and is feeling trapped? What do you do?
Well, I think it goes back to the questions and trying to figure out as an organization, what are you trying to accomplish? And does your culture allow for questions? Because some people, you might feel stuck because if you ask the question, you feel like you're going to be either perceived as not capable, or you're going to be perceived as not valuing the person in authority. So I think the first thing is, what are you trying to accomplish as an organization? Define that clearly, because that your problems are unique to your own organization. And I think a lot of schools and churches experience this, where you look at what everybody else is doing and then you decide like, oh, I need to do what they're doing, but they don't have the same set of problems as you do. And I think so the solution for me is always to reframe it from your customer's perspective using empathy. And then ask questions that get to what does it mean to empathize with our customer, and why maybe do we not have customers coming into our store versus we don't have enough money. It's a very subtle reframing of the question, but what you can do if you don't frame it positively is you end up spending energy on things like Rob said, that are symptoms or maybe aren't even your problem to begin with. And then that feeling of being stuck becomes worse because now you're spending time on solving things that aren't your real problems. So I would say reframe your mind around your customer and then ask the questions that allow you to get down to the root of the problem and not just the symptoms.
So I'll sort of ask the same question to you, Rob. Like, if you're sitting in a meeting and your spidey senses start tingling, what does that kind of tell you need to be doing?
Along the lines of what Ryan just said, you need to start empathizing, okay? And you need to empathize with a few people. One, like Ryan said, who are we solving this problem for, right? And when it comes to net revenue, let's say your revenue's down. Well, who's got the problem? And you say, well, we have the problem, right? And say, okay, well, nobody wants to solve that problem more than we do. But saying that we have this problem doesn't help us to get anywhere, right? We got to go deeper, like Ryan said. The other thing we want to do is empathize with the people who are actually going to do the solving. So when you walk out of a meeting with this to-do list, you want to check in with those people and say, how do you feel after this meeting? You know, and create a culture where people feel free to tell you. Because here's what would happen if people would just do that one thing. They would hear back from their people like, I feel a lot of anxiety because I feel like we didn't actually solve the problems we have. And now I have additional problems like all this other work to do, plus the problem I had before I walked in here. And leaders, you could do so much just by asking the question at the end of the meeting, how do we feel about what just happened here?
Yeah, Rob, I feel like you told me something that there was like a quote by Einstein related to this, something about the problem. Can you tell me that again? Or
yeah, Einstein is purported to have once said that if he were given 1 hour to save the world, he'd spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute solving it.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that because I'm actually a trained mathematician and went to graduate school and did all of the math stuff. And I think one of the biggest things that I learned in all of my time doing mathematics is you don't have any shot at solving a problem if you don't understand what your problem is. And it's kind of like, typically, if I'm sitting there banging my head against the wall trying to solve some problem in mathematics, and I think that this translates to all problems, it's probably because I don't understand what the problem is asking of me. And I kind of feel like, so what do you do? What do you do if you get into one of these situations and you just don't understand the problem? Then you need to dig in deeper and say, okay, what is this problem really asking of me? And so I really like that quote by Einstein where he'd spend, he was a fairly smart guy, right? And I kind of feel like he would take the maximal amount of time understanding what it was he was trying to solve. And in our meetings today, you find that we spend 59 minutes solving problems, and we spend 1 minute defining it.
I think that's 100% true. And what we should be doing in our meetings is walking away feeling really good about the problem because we understand it so well. And that gets people really excited.
Yeah, and if you walked out of a meeting and you didn't solve the problem, but you walked out and you knew what the problem was, that's a win. At least I feel like it's a win. I would feel good walking out of a meeting knowing now I know what we need to solve. So, that's all of this is great stuff. I want to kind of give a little bit of a plug for our next episode. We want to ask the question, how do you know that you have what it takes to solve a problem? So we're talking today about how do you even define a problem and the importance of defining the problem. But once you have a problem defined, how do you know that you have what it takes to solve it? So thanks everybody for listening. See you next time.